Good evening, everybody, and Happy New Year. My name is Carolina Navarro, Deputy Director of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our first lecture of 2023. A few quick announcements before we get started. 2023 might be your year to enroll in one of our watchmaking courses. We're hosting classes in NYC throughout the month and visiting Hawaii on January 13th. For tickets, please visit our website. If you're already a member of HSNY, you may recognize them for delivering complimentary magazines to your door, but tonight, we're pleased to welcome Eurostar as a sponsor. Published in Switzerland, Eurostar dates back to 1927 and is delivered to more than 170 countries around the world. They also have incredible archives dating back to the 30s and are worth taking a look. We thank them for their support in helping meet our mission. As we welcome 2023, we're also proud to welcome two new trustees to HSNY. Paul Boutros, Head of Watches of the Americas at Philips, joins us alongside Lenny Slogan, President of Kalba Art Advisory. We're very happy to be working with them and look forward to working with them in the year 2023. January means the financial aid application period is live, and this year, we're proud to offer two brand new scholarships. The Charles Sauter Scholarship for Innovation in Horology, and the Charles London Scholarship for Watchmaking students. The application period is January 1st to March 1st, and awards of up to $5,000 are available. We now offer 8 financial aid opportunities, and we encourage all students to visit our website to read, apply, and learn more. Okay, and our biggest night of the year is finally confirmed. Now, in its 157th year, HSNY's Gala will take place on Saturday, April 15th at the Harbor Club of New York City, which is right across the street. Save the date and stay tuned for more information. And finally, on to our lecture. Tonight, we welcome back a dear friend of HSNY who lectured in 2019 on the secrets of horological engine turning. Please join me in welcoming Josh Shapiro, owner of J & Shapiro Watches, here to lecture on the birth, death, and rebirth of American watchmaking.
Hello. Did everyone hear me okay? All right. Laser's working. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to my friends that showed up, my new friends. Thank you to the Horological Society of New York for giving me this opportunity to be able to present this information that I'm very passionate about. I can't thank you all enough for being here. And a special thank you to Eric Storley, Michael Rose, and Spencer Torek, who came out here all the way from Los Angeles to join as part of my watchmaking team. Thank you guys for coming along. I'd also really like to thank my wife for letting me come across the country to speak about watches again. And also thank you to my 3 kids who are surviving without me. So tonight's lecture is something I'm extremely passionate about. When I came here 4 years ago to speak about engine turning, I was a little nervous. And tonight, I'm not nervous at all because I'm so excited to share this information with you. Before I get started, I just want to give a little disclaimer that American watchmaking is a fantastically huge subject. There's absolutely no way I can delve into all the depths that there is in American watchmaking. So for sure, at the end of this lecture, people are going to come up to me and say, oh, but you should have spoken about this, or I can't believe you didn't mention that. So I apologize to all of you in advance, but we have a whole bunch of books out from the fantastic library here where you can look and see the depths of American horology. Let's get started. There's an old speaker's maxim. It says, first I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then I'm going to tell it to you. Then I'm going to tell you what I told you. So tonight, we're going to go over some demystification of terms, in-house, handmade, American-made. I feel I can't really explain what American watchmaking is until we really define what watchmaking is as a whole. Then we're going to go through a brief history of American watchmaking, get into who murdered it, and talk about the 21st century resurgence that's happening here. All these wonderful brands that are popping up. All right, so there's a term, in-house, or also manufacture. And I feel that in order to talk about horizontal integration in the Swiss industry or in the US industry where it's vertical integration, everything under one roof, we have to talk about this new term, in-house. As a historian, you always want to look through the lens of the time period, understand history from how people were experiencing it then. And this in-house term is pervasive now in watchmaking. It's a very modern term. The way I like to think of in-house or manufacturer movement is proprietary movement. And specifically, for the last 20 or so years, that's meant mainly independent of ETA. But I'll give you an example of what I mean. You can have a brand that hires someone to design a movement, hire someone to make the movement, and hire someone to assemble the movement, and they'll call that movement an in-house movement. And I feel the correct term for that is proprietary. And I think I'm starting to use that in my language. That would be great if journalists and other individuals started to adopt this much more specific language of proprietary than in-house or manufacture. And lastly, historically, there was no stigma to the Swiss's horizontal integration where they had different factories making each and every part of a watch versus the US where they made it all under one factory. There's no negative or positive stigma associated with that. It was just watchmaking. The other thing that is important to look at is, what does handmade mean? Handmade is a very vague term, and I think it's a confusing term. It can be used as a marketing term. And here, which is important to our lecture, I'm just going to go over some different methods of production, of manufacture, very quickly. So on the left side, we have prototype or one-at-a-time methods. These are the methods that people usually use to describe something that's handmade. So for instance, if you're using a non-computer-aided machine to make one part at a time. So if you see this here, this is a cross slide. I stole this from upstairs. It's got two handles on it. And we can pass this around so everyone can feel it and move it. This is the basis of all manufacturing right here. With manual machinery, using non-computer aided machines to make one part at a time, for the most part we're using something like this, where we're moving the hand wheels by hand. A CNC machine moves those hand wheels computer controlled. That in its most fundamental form is the difference between the two. It's interesting, you can make a watch one at a time using a CNC machine. And people have a preconceived notion that a CNC machine, you just push a few buttons and it does everything for it. And we'll take a look at a video in a second for that. The third method that is about handmade is finishing watch parts one at a time. So turning, hand turning, polishing pivots, polishing pinions, guilloche, anglage, black polish. This is done by one person working on the part one at a time. So on the left is often things that are attributed to handmade. And I encourage you all as consumers of watches or those interested in watches to ask brands when they say handmade, what do they mean by it? How does that fit in this list on the left? And then on the right side, which is very germane to our lecture tonight, is means of mass production. So the old Swiss system was where you'd have thousands of people making one part at a time. So it's a combination of something from the left over to the right, where thousands of people sitting there by hand making the part over and over again. Then the Americans came up with a system where using cams and automated systems, we could make thousands of parts with a single operator, all without computers. And then the last stage of that is CNC automated machines. Let's look at some pictures. So here's Spencer working at the lathe, and you can see his hands are on these hand wheels. This is a manual operation. Right here, he's working on a tiny little pinion. You can also do computer-aided one at a time. So we made a funny little video to kind of show people's preconceived notion of what CNC machining is. Part goes in, push a few buttons, and like magic, the part comes out. And I think that's how most people think CNC works, but to do something like that is hours upon hours and hours of work. It can be in some situations where something done manually is quicker than doing something on a CNC machine. The difference is with a CNC machine, that's going to win on the second, third, and 1,000th part. Let's see. There we go. This is just showing some of the complexity of working out these models. This is Daniel, honing in the machine so you can accurately make parts on a CNC machine. Hours and hours of work to set up. Then we talk about the hand methods that oftentimes when people say handmade, they're describing this. I used to think when something was handmade, I'd envision some watchmaker turned over a bench with a candle, sitting there filing one tooth at a time. But it's not really like that in practice, but these are some operations that are very, very labor intensive. So right here is some pivot polishing of a balance staff. Here's hand finishing. You can only do one part at a time when you're doing hand finishing. And this, I just had to include it. You'll see this tool all the time in sales literature or in some watch boutiques, and it's meant to invoke someone sitting there doing something very interesting and cool with an old-looking machine, but nobody actually uses this. So the old system, this is sort of illustrating what I was talking about. You have lots of human labor making one part over and over and over again. This here was a groundbreaking machine. This is a automated machine that can make thousands of parts with a single operator in the 1870s, so we're talking pre-electricity, and it's all cam operated. And most of us are using cams every day in our engines. It's pretty incredible what we can do with some ingenuity, all pre-computer. And then lastly, this is a CNC farm. And with enough of these machines, you can make absolutely anything and a lot of them. Next, I want to talk about what American-made is, because it's different than Swiss-made. There's a different system we have than they do for putting the made in. So in America, you have to make all or virtually all of every component to say American-made. Everything has to undergo a substantial transformation. And this is a big deal because not all parts are created equal. You have some parts that take tremendous work and are very difficult to source, and other parts that are much easier. The United States has one of the toughest made labels in the world. And that's okay. That means when you're buying an American product, you know what's going inside of it and which country it came from. I'm sort of emphasizing the last point. Today there's not a single US-made mechanical production brand in the country that meets this definition. But almost all the brands that I'm going to mention at the end would meet other countries' definitions of made. So in comparison, here's Swiss-made. And this is what Swiss-made has meant since 1971. A watch is considered Swiss if its movement is Swiss. Its movement is cased in Switzerland. Its manufacturer carries out the final tests in Switzerland, and at least 60% of production costs are generated in Switzerland. So pretty big. Lots of wiggle room allowed in there. And then specifically for the movement has to be assembled in Switzerland, and missing an important component there. Has to be tested by the manufacturer in Switzerland, and at least 60% of production costs are generated in Switzerland, and at least 50% by the value of all components is Swiss-made, excluding the cost of assembly. There's a book that we picked up recently, The Business of Time, And I highly recommend it because it talks about the entire history of watchmaking from the beginning to modern times. And he really goes into great detail about what Swiss made means now and has some pretty staggering statistics about what's made in Switzerland. All right, now we get to the exciting part. Timeline of American watchmaking. We started off as a cottage industry. Not a lot was going on there. Here, a few watches being made. Then in 1854, things really picked up. Waltham, Elgin, and Howard really dominated during this period. From 1914 to 1913, Hamilton and dress pocket watches became quite popular. And then 1930 to 1941 was the period of wristwatches and Swiss competition. This beautiful pocket watch here is one of the earliest pocket watches that we know for certain was made in the United States by John Keynes. And this was in 1800. There's very little information about this time period. Our story really begins with the American system, which was the system of mass-produced interchangeable parts. And this was groundbreaking in all sorts of industries. And Waltham was one of the forerunners for this. There's even a legend that Henry Ford came and visited the Waltham factory and was inspired by that. In 1876, the Swiss visited Waltham and Elgin, and from there they wrote a huge document about everything that the Americans were doing in their factories, because they still had the old Swiss system. They were sitting there making one part at a time with mass labor, and the Americans were really starting to produce a lot of watches, and they were losing a lot of their market share. So they came, produced this document. Jacques David went back to Switzerland, and no one listened to him. And everyone ignored him. And then the more watches America kept making, they decided to give it a look again. 8 manuscripts were written of this document. They're all hidden. The Swiss didn't want anyone knowing about this, and in 1993, one finally resurfaced, and we have a translation of it in the back. And it's pretty comprehensive. It's a pretty amazing document. Here's a great picture of the movement production room in Waltham. So Waltham Watch Company was founded in 1854 by Aaron Dennison. Grew from 12,000 movements in 1860 to 55,000 in 1870 and 413,000 by 1890. For reference, in 1876, before they adopted the American system, it took 7.5 days to complete a watch. When you're trying to make hundreds of thousands of watches, that's a lot of time. In 1883, it took Waltham 2.2 days to make a watch. So that's quite a difference. And here's a beautiful picture of the factory. And you can now live here if you'd like. It's apartments. This is one of the earliest Walthams. You can see this high quality, beautiful movement, 1857. Chatones, beautiful hand engraving, and they were mass producing these. The Waltham Riverside Maximus, one of the most beautiful watches that Waltham made. And you don't have to take my word for it, you can take the word of a foreigner. There is one precision watch, quantity produced, that the American industry can be particularly proud of. This is the Presentation Waltham Riverside Maximus. This super watch, always in a heavy gold case, is worthy of a place in any collection. Fully jeweled and with a diamond end stones to the escapement, it is beautifully finished in machined nickel. The keyless winding mechanism operates with a smoothness rarely equaled by any other maker, and the general attention to detailed finish is worthy of the highest praise. This is not an advertisement for Waltham, but you should go out and buy one, ASAP. And with the strangest thing is, these aren't terribly expensive. Waltham also makes some tremendous complications. And once again, I know I'm skipping a lot, and there's so much I could show on Waltham. We could be here all day, so I'm really picky. This is an amazing complication, and Mark Kozlerich from Hodinkee just wrote a fantastic article about this super complicated Waltham watch. And This is absolutely a marvel of machine. This is a quartz agate case and movement made in the late 1800s. It's absolutely beautiful. They also made a bunch of rock crystal watches too, where you can completely see through and see everything inside of the movement. Pretty impressive stuff. Next is the Elgin National Watch Company. By the way, it can be pronounced Elgin or Elgin. Elgin was started in 1864, 20 minutes outside of Chicago. By 1868, they were producing 30,000 watches a year, and at the company's peak, they had 4,500 employees. This is more than all the watchmakers in the United States by many, many standard deviations there are in this country that just one company was employed at the time. An advertisement in 1928 claimed that there were 14,418 retailer jewelers in the US, and all but 12 carried Elgin. So, pretty impressive. It's funny for us to think about just how dominant the watchmaking companies were in this country. We're living in such a world where the majority of all watches are coming from a few countries, and none of those are the United States. But the domestic market was completely US watches, for the most part. Here's a grade 91. This is one of the highest end Elgin watches. You can see the spectacular finish on all the individual components. And once again, they made tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of movements of this quality. It's extremely impressive. Next company I want to talk on is E. Howard Watch Co. It was founded in 1861 by Edward Howard in Boston. Howard and Dennison worked together and eventually split. And there's a lot of debates by, well, I don't know if there's a lot of debates, but a very small minority of American watch enthusiasts heavily debate whether Dennison or Howard is the father of American watchmaking. They never sold as well as Waltham, and they were eventually absorbed by Hamilton. This is one of my favorite watches. This is a blue jeweled 16-size pocket watch. Absolutely stunning. Then this is later when they were the Keystone E. Howard Company. And you can see the incredible quality of this watch. The Series 0. We have some also interesting individuals that were producing watches in this country. Albert Potter was born in New York, and he made about 55 watches in the US between 1856 and 1876. And then he said forget it, and he moved to Switzerland. And there he continued making watches of extremely high quality. Chronometer pocket watches with these absolutely fascinating bridge layouts. Very inspiring. And there's Charles Quasalt, who started a factory in 1861 in Albany, New York. A lot of watchmaking in this state. He created an original coaxial escapement, and our very own Nicholas Manousis actually recently incorporated this escapement into a wristwatch movement. George Samos has written about this escapement, possible source of inspiration for him, but done here in 1861. The next company, and I know you're not supposed to have favorites, and I definitely don't have a favorite child, but Hamilton is my favorite of the old companies. The company was started in 1892 on a 13-acre complex in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I always thought in my head that they were honoring Alexander Hamilton, but it turns out that the person that owned all the land their facility on had the last name Hamilton. They became popular making extremely precise railroad watches. Railroad watches is about a 5-year long semester course in any college, probably tens of thousands of pages of information on railroad watches alone. So I can't go into too much detail about that. I remember when I was asking Nick how long I could speak for, and he said, well, you better keep it to an hour. And I said, do I have to? He's like, well, I mean, you could speak longer, but I can't guarantee that anyone will actually be here by the end of it. So they started producing their first wristwatches in 1917, and in 1928 they purchased the Illinois Watch Company. This is a fantastic picture of a lady watchmaker using a precision scale to fit balance screws to a balance. And if you've ever seen how tiny those screws, you know how much skill it takes to put screws like that in there. You can see her loop. It's a great picture. I don't touch on this enough, but these watch factories had extremely high percentages of women working in the factories, as skilled and as unskilled laborers. There was really quite an equalizer of skills. This is one of the greatest American pocket watches made. This is one of my favorites. This is the Hamilton 16 size 950. This was their most popular 16 size watch. In the 23 jewel version, there was a 992, which was 21 jewels. I think they probably made a lot more of those. But you can just see the quality here. Absolutely incredible. Hamilton started making dress watches that were smaller, and many other brands at the same time. Once everyone got over having a large railroad watch, started getting into these more dress watches, watches that you could wear in your pocket, take to fancy places. Hamilton produced one of the highest quality movements, the 992 masterpiece, beautiful 23 jewel movement, usually in a platinum or 18 karat gold case. Absolutely lovely. And then eventually they would go to smaller. And this is my favorite movement. It's about 38.9 millimeters, so a lot of people have adapted them into wristwatches. That's how I first came to discover this watch. But this was the continuation of masterpieces. These watches were produced in 10 size from the 1930s all the way to the death of Hamilton in the 1960s. And this was their nicest in the 10 size. This slide here is the reason I'm here talking to all of you. When I was collecting these movements and these watches, I found a Hamilton masterpiece from the 1970s. I thought to myself, well, I know Hamilton was gone at that point. They weren't in the United States anymore, so how are they producing a masterpiece watch? So I bought the watch, opened up the back, and this is what I found inside of it. On the left is, the 923 produced in the heyday of Hamilton, and on the right is a Unitas 6497 resting inside of a Hamilton masterpiece case. And this bothered me so much. This bothered me so much. Maybe this will all make you squirm in your seat, but when I saw this felt like to me that if the Japanese bought Patek Philippe and started putting Yoda movements in Patek Philippe, that'd probably bother a few people. That's how I feel when I look at this. Here are some examples of Illinois Watch Co.'s wristwatches. They make beautiful Art Deco wristwatches. I can't do this subject justice. In the back, Frederick Friedman wrote a 1,600-page, 5-volume set that we're holding up right there. 1,600 pages on Illinois Watch Company. I'm giving it a single slide. Hamilton made some tremendously cool wristwatches. Elvis's Ventura on the right. This is one of those subjects where people are going to come up to me and say, I can't believe you can talk more about wristwatches. With the Lord Elgin on the left. Just beautiful, beautiful watches. Waltham has a military watch on the right and their dress watch on the left. Waltham Premier, this is the language they use in their pocket watches and they brought over to their wristwatches. Waltham, of the three brands I'm covering here so far of Hamilton, Elgin, and Waltham had the most difficult time converting away from large 16-size pocket watches and getting to the smaller watches and then wristwatches. They were just so massively tooled up for 16-size pocket watches, it was very difficult for them to change over. And then, of course, there's Bulova wristwatches. I have mixed feelings about Bulova. I think they make fantastic, beautiful watches. They were importers of Swiss movements, and I found it very difficult to figure out how much they made in America and how much they made in Switzerland. There's no real way to know, but you can see 3 Bulova movements here. The 2 on the left are American-made automatic Bulova watches, and on the right is a Swiss-made Bulova winding. And I don't know if you can tell in the picture, they're all identical. So I'm not exactly sure how that worked at the time, but I'm sure I could spend a few decades researching it. Let's look at the numbers. I've tried not to do too many numbers. I'm a teacher as well in a high school, and numbers have an excellent ability to put people to sleep. But these are pretty fascinating, so I want to share them with you. In 1790, there may be 10,000 watches being made in the United States, none actually from American components, imported from Switzerland, just a tiny percentage of the market. In comparison, there are about 150,000 watches, 38% of the market coming from Switzerland. Great Britain was the leader at this point in the 1790s. Well, Switzerland made 150,000 watches. This was the heyday of British watchmaking. They made about 200,000. On a quick side note, the British never industrialized. And I think they would have, but they had established watch guilds. And the watch guilds took a look at this new machinery and they said, we'll keep doing it the old-fashioned way. And they were eventually put out of business just because they couldn't keep up. In 1870, things started heating up. The Americans put out 150,000 watches and had 5% of the global market. When I say 5% of the market, I'm talking about the global market. For 1870, 1890, and 1814, it's 90% of the American market. In comparison, in 1870, Switzerland made 2.1 million watches and had 70% of the market. In 1890, we have 1.5 million watches, 16% of the market. Switzerland did 5 million, 52. And then 1914 is one of those incredible years where just supplying mostly for the US market, the Americans really caught up. 8.5 million watches, 32.6% of the market, versus Switzerland's 10.5 million watches. So that's pretty incredible for a one-market economy for the United States. And you can see in 1890, only 3.4% of the watches were exported out of the United States. I've talked to a lot of people outside of the country. Very few people outside of the country aren't even aware that we had a watchmaking industry. All right, so this is the area that I put a lot of research in. There's a lot of information, like I said, about all our great American watch brands, but there's actually very little information out there on what killed American watchmaking. This is the part that makes my blood boil. So, from 1930 to 1941, the US signed treaties with Switzerland, and we'll get into that. In 1841 and 1945, America goes to war, and the Swiss capitalize on that. From 45 to 64, the industry is chronically going to Congress asking for help, to no avail. And by the 60s, Elgin and Hamilton closed their doors. Bulova would actually keep going until 1978 with their factory in Queens, until 1978. Many people aren't aware, but the Swiss actually had a cartel. They had a super holding company that started forming itself from 1927 to 1934, called ASUAG. You can see where the asterisk goes, and maybe some native German speakers can pronounce that for us. So this super holding company brought controlling shares from all the major producers in Switzerland. And it was an amalgamation of banks, the government, and the big main producers of movements and machinery and complete watches. And they ruled with an iron fist in Switzerland. Any new companies that started up in Switzerland would have to get approval and get on board. And this was to protect Swiss interests, to make sure that parts were being sent to Great Britain or France or the United States that they could use to assemble in their watches. It was either complete movements or nothing. And it also allowed them to really concentrate their efforts and focus on markets in ways they couldn't have ever before. With the Swiss cartel combining with US trade agreements, we see many more watches being imported, starting in 1936. The Swiss are relying on a lot of imports from the United States. Hundreds of millions of dollars of imports in those dollars, billions in today's dollars. So it was in the United States' interest to work out a trade agreement with Switzerland. So to encourage this trade, the US lowered tariffs by 34% on Swiss watch movements, which was a big deal. Almost immediately by 1937, we see US domestic watch sales fall from 53% to 39%. And it's only going to keep falling. But pause for a second. In 1941 to 1945, Waltham, Elgin, and Hamilton stopped all production of domestic watches. It means during this period, there are no new watches being produced by the Americans at all. All three of those companies completely went to war. Hamilton made some incredible watches during this time period. Really inspirational how quickly they tooled to meet the Navy's demands for an extremely accurate chronometer. They made the Model 21 and the Model 22. The Model 21 was consistently accurate to 0.5 seconds a day, which is an incredible rate. And they made this in the time span from the beginning of December to the beginning of 1942. All efforts focused on this. The Germans weren't allowing the Swiss to export any marine chronometers because they knew how important it was for the Navy ships. Here you can see, George Daniels was a fan. He had a Hamilton Model 21. In the middle is a picture of the first Model 21. And on the right is one of the biggest pocket watches you could possibly buy. This is almost a life-size image. The Model 22 deck watch, which became really popular, and Hamilton's like, no, you should keep buying the Model 21, but everyone wanted the Model 22 in the war. And then they kept producing them afterwards too. They're very popular. Hamilton also made the Model 23, which was a military chronograph. And this was the only production chronograph ever made in the United States. And also, once again, they're able to come out with it very quickly. Before I started researching this lecture, I always had in the back of my mind that, well, maybe one of the reasons the US watchmaking industry died was they just couldn't keep pace with Swiss new technologies. And you kind of see this around in literature, and it's a little bit of a myth because within a few years we were able to produce pretty complex watches very quickly. And I think without the factors that we're going to discuss shortly, I think it would have been very easily for Hamilton to continue to progress watchmaking in the United States. The Swiss watch industry during World War II. So I have a little disclaimer. The following information applies to the Swiss watch industry in World War II, not individual Swiss watchmakers then or now. I found that there's very little information about the Swiss watchmaking industry during World War II. I can't say that that's on purpose, but it was very difficult to find information. One document that helped me find a lot of information was this document produced by the International Commission of Experts Switzerland. And it took historians from all around the world, and they really went in deep examining Switzerland's involvement in Nazi Germany. World War II ended in 1845, and it took until 2002 for a really comprehensive study of what Switzerland was up to come out. They published a 597-page report in 2002, some light bathroom reading, and they found that Switzerland was not neutral.
Yes.
84% of munitions made went to Axis countries. They also laundered about 12 billion in gold for Nazi Germany. And some of you can probably guess where some of that gold came from. What was the Swiss watchmaking industry up to? Well, bombs aren't very productive if they're exploding at the time you don't want them to. So you need a fuse timer. And the Swiss were one of the big suppliers for these bombs and fuse timers in Nazi Germany. Tavenes, and also under another holding name, Tavaro, supplied about 1.7 million fuses to the Nazis. To do this, they asked Jewish members of their board to step down to make the deal with Germany. Swiss watch companies supplied over 330 million pinions for fuses to the Nazis. The company Dixie supplied 51 million francs of detonators. Dixie owned Zenith, which I didn't know this until I discovered this, was blacklisted in the United States after World War II. And the rest of the watchmaking industry saw the most incredible opportunity of all time. The extremely lucrative US market finally had no domestic competition. I'd like you all to imagine that SpaceX takes up all of Tesla's time. The government asks Tesla to just focus on SpaceX. So they spend 4 years completely abandoning Tesla, just focusing on SpaceX, not making a single car. And then 4 years later, they come back on the market, they're going to be at a pretty serious disadvantage. And that's what happened here. Well, the US watchmaking industry was away, the Swiss came in. Around 43.5 million watches were exported to the US. That's about 7 billion adjusted for inflation. Maybe some of you guys can help me with this. I was not able to figure out how they were able to get this many watches out of Switzerland. I do know that the Americans, because the automotive industry was busy making tanks and other military vehicles, there wasn't a lot to buy at this period, and the Swiss gave them something to buy. This is what I mean about I'm not sure how Switzerland was able to get watches out of Switzerland. In 1942, where they were exporting a lot of watches, they were completely surrounded. Makes sense to be in 44, 45, when France and Italy had already fallen. But I'm not sure before that. Here's some pretty incredible numbers. In 1941, the United States made 1,886 watches. Right? We only entered the war in December of 1941. The Swiss made 4,168,000. So they were winning, but it was bad, but not so bad. In 1946, the numbers fell tremendously for the United States, and the numbers went up just a little bit for the Swiss. So this was obviously a huge issue. Obviously a huge issue for the US watch market. So the Swiss really killed the American watch industry. How? Favorable tariffs that allowed the Swiss to undercut prices. This was a big one. After the war, the Swiss refused to sell the Swiss refused to sell the Americans watchmaking machinery. So once again, to use our Tesla analogy, imagine Tesla after a 4-year hiatus trying to get back into the EV market, but not having any machines to do it. And then lastly, Congress went to the Swiss and said, okay, let's set some limits. So they said, okay, 7.7 million watches. And then they exported 9.6 million. So they weren't really listening to their own limits on imports into the US. There are many instances of the leaders of these companies going to Congress and pleading their case. This is by T. Albert Potter, no relation, I believe, to the pocket watchmaker from 100 years prior. He was the president of Belgium, And I really felt that he succinctly put together the best arguments for what was going on at the time. Let us briefly review the situation. Increased pre-war competition from imported watches, together with the elimination of domestic watches from the civilian market during the war years, brought about a Swiss monopoly in the market in the US. Coupled with these inroads into our business, we find the Swiss unwilling to sell us machinery required to rehabilitate that worn out in the production of implements of war. Not a good situation to be in. Elgin Hamilton Waltham would frequently go to Congress. In this document that I pulled from the president of Elgin, there was a watchmakers guild that represented 8,000 watchmakers in the United States. And the leader of their guild went to Congress and argued and argued and argued for increased Swiss tariffs. But what I discovered, this would infuriate my wife, but I'd be researching something and thought I had it all figured out, and then I'd discover something else entirely. I'm like, oh, you gotta hear this. I can't believe this. So there was a whole watch assemblers union in the United States that represented Bulova, Benrus, Gruen, Longines, and these were importers of Swiss movements into the United States. So they wanted tariffs as low as possible on Swiss imported movements, right? That would make their watches to be even more competitive. And they had their own union, and that union was going toe-to-toe with the union for Elgin, Hamilton, Waltham. And they were vying and arguing, and you see it again and again through these documents throughout the 1945, 47, 49, 52, again and again and again, this battle. And they lost. They lost very badly. This is the Elgin Watch Factory on the left. This is the Elgin Watch Factory on the right in 1968. And it's kind of tragic. We have some of our factories. Waltham's factory, like I said, you can live there. Hamilton's factory, you can live there, and they have nice museums at the bottom that honor the dead carcass of American watchmaking. Elgin had this beautiful tower, and they blew it up. Waltham goes bankrupt in 1949, taken over by the Swiss shortly after, which means that a new company bought the Waltham name, started importing watches. Elgin experiences steady decline, tries electric watches, goes out of business by 1968. Hamilton has a similar fate. They began importing Swiss movements in the 60s, and finally, eventually, they just say, forget it altogether. They moved to Switzerland in 1969. They were partners in the Buren watch factory. All that got sold in 1971. And talking with a lot of old timers, they talk about how the owners of Hamilton told the last employees of the Hamilton watch factory to take everything to the dump. All the documents, all the machinery, everything. I don't know how true it is. I've talked to some people that have owned a lot of the machinery that came from this, that were in storage containers in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that allegedly came literally from the dump. But it's pretty sad. Bulova, with the success of the Accutron, were the last holdouts. The Accutron has about 15 jewels in it, lots of wheels and pinions, and I believe they're producing a good chunk of those here domestically. But they couldn't stand up to the quartz crisis either. And in 1978, they closed down their doors. And Omega and Rolex had a field day. I say this a little bit snarkily, but the two most American watches we have today are the ones you're looking at right now. They took Snoopy. And I don't know if any of you guys know this, but the first watch on the moon was the Omega Speedmaster. And of course, we have the Rolex Daytona and Paul Newman. Daytona is the name of the city in the United States of America where a race happens. So they put putting aside the stuff, they did a really excellent job of tying into this post-World War II generation that wanted an adventure. And these companies really gave it to them. And it's no coincidence that these lines of watches were successful all the way through even the quartz crisis, because they had such a strong base in America and in other countries. Right? There's of course the James Bond watch, but you know, it's Swiss made in English for a reason. Like, we're a huge market, and still are today. A quick note on Timex and Fossil. Timex watches were immensely popular through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were pin lever watches, which means they were unjeweled. They're mechanical watches, but they were able to produce millions of them. So I kept looking at statistics of watch production in the 60s, and even though I knew that Waltham, Elgin, Hamilton were all dying and the Accutron hadn't come out yet, there's still a lot of watches being produced in the United States, and I realized it was the Timex with the pin lever watches. They made 10 million of these a year. They were basically, Timex would be very upset with me for saying this, but they're almost disposable mechanical watches. I had a really nice experience speaking with Jim Matthews, who is someone I bought a lot of equipment from, and he worked at Timex from 1967 to 77. It was really just amazing to hear him talk about this giant factory with all these automatic assemblies to put together these unjeweled watches. And you've all probably heard of Fossil. Fossil, through the fossil of American watchmaking, started importing watches completely made from Hong Kong, and they're quite successful now. So they really helped also kind of fill this void in the United States, but very far from US made. This last section, which should all give us hope, is all the wonderful brands that are popping up in the United States. And I'm really excited to share them with you. There are a lot of brands. Not all of them are here. The people I have listed here are the people I have a relationship with. We'd be here for a lot longer if I were to go through every brand that exists in America today, and that's a great thing. Here are a bunch of brands. Maybe some of them you've heard of, maybe some of them you haven't. Mark Carson builds beautiful watches in Hawaii. Arpege Watches takes pocket watch movements and cases them in beautiful cases. As I'm reading this, I realized I forgot to put in Vortic, but I don't actually know them, but they also do the same thing, and it's wonderful. Vera Watches is doing a lot of manufacturing in Oregon. Peter Dobble is making chronometers in Idaho. Oh, I did have Vortic. Okay. Barrel Hand is doing very exciting work with 3D printers out of San Francisco. I highly recommend looking at their watches. Havid Nagan is local in LA. He's putting together a beautiful watch. Artur Akhmeev, who also works for me, makes beautiful hand-engraved watches. We'll see a picture in the next slide. Aldous Hodge, who's part of this society, is also working on a project. Icon 4x4, who makes really amazing cars in Los Angeles. You should check them out. They also put out a watch. Darren Tiffany, a very good friend of mine, makes wonderful watches. And he also makes the machines that he makes the watches on, which is very impressive. Cell watches make really tough titanium watches. Paul Roytzen, this is a hobby for him, and he produced a watch completely from scratch, every single component. Pretty amazing. You can look him up as Texas Watchmaker. Dan Spitz is also working on a great project. Zach Smith makes parts for watches, parts that are very difficult to find in the repair world or from Rolex embargoes, and he makes them himself. An extremely talented individual. Weiss Watch makes beautiful field watches. Townsend Watch, skeleton watches. Ian Schoen is mostly making pens now, but he's doing some really stunning watches in Pennsylvania. Dean Sarnell and Jacob Curtis are doing some of the top level restoration work in this country. Their company is Once Upon a Time. Don Loke, who's here tonight, also makes wonderful watches and has a lot in store for us. David Lindau who is a great friend of mine. There's a organization called Plumier. You can go there and you can use rose engines and straight line machines, and it's a really wonderful organization. And David Lindau is a Renaissance man himself. He makes clocks, he makes the machines himself. Really highly recommend checking out that organization. There's Brew here in New York, which has really wonderful designs. Lab, who hopefully you all know, makes wonderful collaborations. And lastly, my friend Brad Taylor. It's a lecture on American watches, so North America, so Canada counts. Here's a picture of one of Darren's watches. He does really fine rose engine work, also makes the case, basically everything you can see here. This is Arthur, who does incredible hand engraving work. Absolutely stunning. This is a koi fish watch. I wanted to show some of Jacob's restoration work. This is a movement that he completely went through and brought back to life. He also makes a great pegwood sharpener. And we can't really have a conversation about American watchmaking without talking about Roland Murphy. He was really the first one to come back to this country and say, we can do it here. We can make a whole lot of components here. And so in 1992, he started making watches, and within a few years, he was making his 801 series, his Caliber 20 series, using a lot of American parts. And then eventually his tourbillon as well. And I don't know how many watchmakers he's an inspiration for, but he's definitely an inspiration for me. And really the pathfinder back to American watchmaking. I'm very close with David Walter. He's an Australian-born watchmaker, and he lives near Santa Barbara now. He worked for Omega Complications in Vienna in the 70s, and then started tinkering with clocks. And didn't just tinker, he made some of the highest quality and complicated clocks ever made. It's really, really a pleasure to have him local. Just a tremendous source of resources. And over the last 10 years, he's really gone back to his roots, to high-end wristwatch projects, the Presidio, the White, the Azure, which was this beautiful pocket watch. He's got a lot more in store as well. You can see the tourbillon table clock on the left that he made in between making watches. And on the right is a really unique and beautiful Mandarin calligraphy dialed watch. Keaton Myrick is another person you all should know the name of. He began making watches in 2013 in Oregon, and his finishing is just so incredible. He's a one-man team, and the level of work that he does is incredible. I highly recommend looking into his watches. I'd like to talk about Nick Harris. He's the owner of Orion Watches. He makes extremely thin dive watches. I'm wearing one right now. He also started a Tesseract project where he's making American components and building a watch it's very difficult to make a watch from scratch. If you try to make every component right off the bat, millions of dollars. So he's doing it bit by bit. And then he also founded the Watchmakers Corner, which is a group of about 200 watchmakers from the US and abroad that we share. There's some members here, see smiling. But it's just a really incredible group started by Nick that allows watchmakers in this country and abroad to share information, to share technical documents, to share their frustrations, share everything that's going on in the industry. And really big kudos for him for forming this organization and being so passionate about it. There's me in our company. I was looking for a group picture that had all of us in it. I wasn't super successful. Every once in a while we take a break, so we went go-kart racing, but it's a great picture of all of us. In our company, there's Arthur Akhmave, Eric Storley, Michael Rose, Daniel Gonzalez, and Spencer Tarak, and Ali Tsuashvili. And they're the team. And we've been really really working hard, making some beautiful watches. Extremely talented individuals. I'm very lucky to work with them. We've amassed about $2 million of equipment over the last 4 years. Do a lot of hard work. We have some of the most cutting edge machines, a door away from machines from the 1890s. And it's really fun. It's really fun to come into work and have a machine that's pre-industrial next to a machine that can drill a hole in a human hair. It's pretty humbling. Our goal, as you may have guessed, is to proudly put US made on our timepieces. To do that, I launched the Infinity series, and we began with very classic designs and traditional designs. And then I'd have a customer that would say, "Hey Josh, can you do this?" And I'd say, "I think so. Sure, let's try it." So in May of 2020, we launched a series of meteorite engine turn dials with collective horology. And then December of 2021, we launched our tantalum series. And that was a big deal for us because tantalum's not a fun metal to work with, and it was the first tantalum case produced outside of Switzerland. So that was a big deal for us, not just watch dials, but now the cases. And then the last part of the puzzle is making the movement. And we have in the back our alpha prototype that we're already beyond now, but that's what I felt comfortable sharing with you all. And in it, we've made the entire dial side mechanism, pound slot mechanism, entire winding assembly, pedal, arbor, ratchet, crown wheel, all wheels and pinions, balance wheel, balance staff, all bridges and plates. And it's been a lot of work, and my team of watchmakers have put so much time and dedication and energy into it. It's really a pleasure working with them every day and restoring this industry the best we can. You can't talk about horology in this country anymore without talking about this organization. So I didn't make a slide about this because I knew I would possibly embarrass some people, or maybe they wouldn't want me to put it in, but HSNY is really special, really special. And the entire team, and especially, as you guys all know, Nick Manousis has put so much time and energy into this organization over the last few years. Myself excluded, the best speakers in the world come here to talk about horology. They come to US soil to talk about what's going on in the world of watchmaking. And it's just really wonderful to see an organization that's putting so much time and effort into a wonderful library, all these ideas and plans, and really restoring the prestige of America-related horology. Like, we're more than just a market for the Swiss. We've got some serious horology going on here. And so I'd like to end with a quote from the president of Belgium, once again. I feel like this really captures what was happening to him and what we can avoid now. We, Elgin, Hamilton, Waltham, could probably sacrifice this industry and make a deal with the Swiss for our product. Under such circumstances, we would continue to make money, probably even more money. And I assure you it would be much easier to compete with the importers on an equal footing than to compete against the cost advantages they now enjoy. It is for this reason I say to you with all the sincerity in my heart, and I speak for all the other men connected with the managements of these companies, we have a real, very real desire to protect America and not let her down. There's nothing wrong with that, and I know you gentlemen feel the same way about it. Then he was talking about from Swiss imports, but now I feel that we are all stewards here for this tremendous history of American watchmaking. There's still been more time where we've had an industry than we haven't. And we have an opportunity now, all these wonderful brands that I mentioned and everything that HSNY is doing to really make sure that this industry continues to grow and thrive and be an independent industry in its own right again. Here's just a quick little bibliography, in case you are all wondering if I made up all this information or if it actually came from somewhere. so please take a look. Some of these books are in the library here. Take a look at them. And that's it. Thank you all so much.
Josh, thank you so much for such an amazing, incredible lecture. We have a full house tonight. I'm not even going to waste any time. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
I can't believe I did it in 65 minutes. That was my first run through.
Any questions for Josh?
Just a comment. While Omega may have been the first on the moon, I think the Accutron was the first in space.
Right.
That one.
For some reason, Omega doesn't advertise that.
I'll throw it out there, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you very much for your discussion. As someone who started a business from the ground up, what is the single most difficult or challenging component of creating your business from scratch that you can identify as, this was it. This was the hardest challenge to go from dream to American Watchmaker?
I guess all artist craftsmen, one of the most difficult things in any project is to finish something. As a craftsman, we're always trying to do things a little bit more perfect. But wait, if I just spend more time on it, I can make it that much better. And there's always a balancing act with that, because if you keep doing that, you don't actually finish anything. So I found for me that's always been the big challenge, is balancing how much do we strive after perfection and how much do we say, we've done an incredible job here, now it's time to finish this. And I think a lot of craftsmen struggle with that.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions?
Josh,
Yeah.
where do you see the American watchmaking industry in 10 years? Look into your crystal ball, what happens in 10 years?
Well, I certainly hope it's much less of a reliance on movements that are being made by other people and parts that are made by other people. We have incredible manufacturing facilities here. Like I work in the aerospace industry. Like that's where my company is. And all the machine producers are there. We're building incredible things here. We can't make a watch? Like, come on. I mean, yeah, so to answer your question, I hope in 10 years, a lot more happening in the domestic market. I hope there's a lot more brands popping up. Back in the heyday of pocket watches, there were over 100 pocket watch companies in the United States that popped up and went out of business during this golden era of time. And there's plenty of market to steal away from the Swiss. So we've got a lot of growing that we can do.
Thank you so much. Some friendly competition. Any more questions? Up front.
So you concentrated on mechanical, which makes total sense given your audience. Where do you see the future of American quartz?
That's a great question. I'm not so up in that field. And I guess that's because we've all got to focus on a specific area. But, I know we've done a lot with it here in the past. I know we're looking more into that area, but yeah, that's just an area I'm not too familiar with. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. Excellent.
Thank you.
I've been curious since your previous lecture, where and how did you acquire 19th century rose engine?
Oh, that's a deep, dark world. It's who you know, 100%. The best place to start is go to Plumier, talk to David Lindau. That's the best. I mean, he manufactures rose engine machines. He manufactures modern rose engine machines. Sourcing an old one can be very challenging, and you've got to just talk to the right people. He's a great person to start and not hesitate. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
What do you think is the main component or components preventing, that completely made in the U.S. designation? Would you want to see like a modification, like maybe if they made some exception but it was still a strict standard, or would you prefer that it has to be everything is here?
Yeah, and that's like the mother of all tangents is jewel making in the United States. Like, I could give at least a 3-hour lecture on American jewels and jewel manufacturing and how much we actually made in the United States versus how much we didn't. But I'd say that one of the most challenging parts, hands down, to make in a watch is the least attractive, that people think the least about, and that's watch pinions. Watch pinions with their tiny pivots is an extremely difficult part to manufacture. And so when people start making a watch, they'll usually use the wheel train components from another watch, a donor movement, and then they'll make the bridges and the plates, which is on the easier side of components to create. But definitely pinions and parts like it that are doing a lot of the timekeeping aspects of the watch versus the beauty side of the watch are very challenging to make, and that's the part that people need to make. We saw before that Switzerland exported 330 million pinions to the Germans because those parts are really hard to make and you really have to be set up for them. That's where we spend a lot of our time in making those parts.
All right, thank you, Josh. Anybody else with a question?
Thank you for your lecture, Josh. I just wanted to ask if you envision J. Shapiro watches making all of the components or most of the components, or are you hoping that there's going to be other manufacturers in the U.S. who are going to help you achieve the goal of being U.S. made?
Right now we're trying to do a lot in our own factory because there's not industry specifically set up for them. So if you go to an aerospace company that's accustomed to working on gigantic things and say, hey, I want to make 5 watch pinions, can you help me out? It's a little difficult. And there are people that are making like medical parts that are set up to do these parts, but it's challenging speaking with someone from another industry. They don't understand watchmaker tolerances or things that are specific or important to watchmakers. So just dealing with suppliers is always a difficult thing. Dealing with suppliers for parts that need to be made the way you want them is even more challenging. So we're doing a lot of it ourselves, but there's people that are popping up in this country that are capable of doing it. And I hope that as I grow, I can grow suppliers as well. And it can be a horizontally integrated country for manufacturing parts, not just vertically oriented like the old Hamilton, Elgin, Laughlin factories were. Great question.
Thanks so much. Last few questions, if anybody has.
Excellent questions all around. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm sure Josh is going to stick around for a little bit. One more round of applause.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's staying so long.
And thank you everybody for joining us. We wish you a great year and we hope to see you next month.